everyone. Welcome to today's latest Booktrib live chat. Today we are chatting with Frank Schaeffer, author of Why I Am an Atheist Who Believes in God, How to Give Love, Create Beauty, and Find Peace. Frank is the New York Times best-selling author of several books, including Crazy for God, How I Grew Up as One of the Elect, helped found the religious right and take it all, or almost all of it, back. Frank is one of the most popular bloggers for patheos.com, and he was one of the first bloggers for Huffington Post. He is also a movie director, speaker, fine artist, a father of 3, and grandfather of 5. He has appeared on Oprah, Fresh Air with Terry Gross, Rachel Maddow, and The Today Show. For more information, you can visit frankschaeffer.com. Today we're giving away a copy of Why I Am an Atheist, so after the chat, head over to booktrib.com to enter to win. And as always, remember to sign up at Booktrib to get the latest on live chats, giveaways, original content, and so much more. So without further ado, please help me welcome Frank Schaeffer. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
And so we're going to do a kickoff question. So Frank, for those of us who don't know, could you talk a little bit about your background growing up in an evangelical community?
Sure. You know, I've written about this and I talk about it a little in the book, but my dad became a very famous evangelical leader in the 1970s and 80s. And when I say famous, I mean in that ghetto, if you like. So evangelicals would have known who he was then. And he's credited, if you want to put it that way, with being one of the founders of the religious right. So I grew up hanging around with people like Billy Graham, Pat Robertson, Dr. Dobson from Focus on the Family. We knew 3 different presidents. In fact, Mike Ford, President Ford's son, was studying with my dad, and his wife Gail used to babysit my daughter when I was, 30, 40 years ago. So we had a lot of connections with the power politics of what became the religious right and then the Republican Party. I left all that in 1984 after my dad died, gradually got out, and then eventually just closed the door, completely changed my views. And of course, my book really talks about my spiritual journey away from evangelical fundamentalism to what I regard as a kind of a progressive spirituality, where I embrace paradox and doubt instead of all of these religious certainties that I was raised on. So that's a kind of a real fast thumbnail sketch that brings you up to speed.
Thank you. So what was your role in the founding of the religious right?
Well, I've written about this. Fact, on Salon.com, there's a big piece up right now that they redid on Alternet a couple days ago, talking about the homeschool movement, the pro-life movement, all these things we were part of. I guess my role really was I was a facilitator first to get my dad much better known. I wrote and directed 2 big documentary series with him, How Should We Then Live, and then Whatever Happened to the Human Race, that also featured Dr. C. Everett Koop, who became Ronald Reagan's Surgeon General after the film series came out. And those really established the evangelical presence in what became known as the pro-life movement or the anti-abortion movement. So I facilitated Dad's rise in that movement. And then I guess I went on and became a kind of a sidekick to him in that nepotistic sort of evangelical way that evangelicals or the mob or the British royal family kind of take for granted. If you're somebody's son or in their family, it seems normal for you to follow in their footsteps. I don't think it is normal, but it seemed that way. So for about 10 years, I was on the circuit, flying around in Jerry Falwell's jet. I was the keynote speaker at the Southern Baptist Convention one year, believe it or not, back in my mid-20s. A lot of crazy stuff. So I got heavily invested in it, and then when I walked away, of course, I left that all behind me and went to Hollywood for a while, made 4 low-budget feature films that are, if you stay up late night TV, sometimes you might see them. And then was fortunate enough to write a novel called Portofino, which actually became very successful, got great reviews, got translated into 9 languages, and was put me on the map as a kind of, I guess, literary writer. And that's, 12 or 15 books ago. That brings us up to the latest one, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God, which is a work of literary nonfiction, but I've kind of split my time between fiction and nonfiction.
Excellent. So we have some questions coming in from viewers, and Janet says, can you tell us what you mean when you say that you are an atheist who believes in God?
Well, obviously I'd love you to run out to Barnes & Noble and buy the book and find out, or go to Amazon and click on it. But to give you the thumbnail, really, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God is a title that is supposed to be a signal to a reader that this is a book that is anti-labeling. So what I really mean by that is that no one can be summed up by any one label. And in that sense, I've never met a Christian or a Jew or an atheist or an agnostic. I've just met human beings like me on a journey. Sometimes we change our minds, sometimes we grow and live. So let me take it out of the religious context and give you another title that would be similar. Why I've been married for 40 years and sometimes hate my wife. Or why I love my children and sometimes I get sick of them. Or why I'm glad I live in Massachusetts and wish I could move to Paris. Okay, you could say, well, how could you do both? Well, if you really think about it, the only problem anybody would have with a title like Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God is if they see everything in kind of certainty black and white categories, and I just don't. So the title leads into the essence of the book, which is, listen, there are irresolvable questions and paradoxes when it comes to issues of faith, family, and all the rest of it. And instead of trying to resolve everything, let's embrace the paradox. And one way I do that in the book is not by writing a preaching kind of book telling people how they ought to believe. I tell stories about my children and my grandchildren, my relationship with Jeannie that I've been married to now for 45 years, just the way life works. And the way life works for me is this aspect of a journey. So I'm a very different person at 62 as a grandfather than I was, say, at age 17, 18 when I got Jeannie pregnant when we were boyfriend and girlfriend, had a baby as a teenage father. That's not anywhere like the person I am now. I can't even remember who that is, but it was all one person. Well, similarly, I've been on a spiritual journey. And so this book really, I hope, opens the door for the reader to embrace paradox and questions and not worry about a lack of certainty, which I think is actually a good thing, a lack of certainty in these areas. And so, I talk about our present day and age when it comes to this debate between atheism and faith as a kind of a battle between certainty addicts. These are people who want absolute questions. And I'm trying to open a door to a different way of looking at things.
So, back in your 20s, I think, was that when you decided that you just didn't fit in with the values? When did you realize that? Like, what was the turning point when you realized you didn't really fit in with the values espoused by the evangelical community?
Well, I think it was a gradual process, but really, this may surprise some people, but it was almost more aesthetic than it was religious at first. Look, the evangelical fundamentalist religious right is ugly. They didn't like the movies I like. They don't like the art I like. They didn't like my gay friends. There's a lot of bigotry. And I kind of inherited this mantle. But when I grew up enough to really kind of look at things a little bit for myself at first, I realized that I was kind of stuck in the same way that a guy like Prince Charles is. I'm not making an analogy, but, one morning you wake up and you say, gee, do I really want to be the King of England? I wanted to be an architect. Well, I wanted to be in the arts. I wanted to be a writer. Who wants to be schlepping around with a bunch of people like Jerry Falwell, making money off preaching hate against gay people? I mean, who wants, ask any kid when they grow up, do you want to be a bigot when you grow up? Who's going to say, yeah, that's just what I want to do? So I realized young enough, although there was a lot of money in the God business, that if I spent my life in this, it would ruin me. And one thing it would ruin would be my marriage, because I was hating these times on the road and coming back angry. Another thing it was going to ruin was my spiritual faith. I'm not trying to be a smartass here, but there's no quicker route to losing your faith than being a professional religious person who's making their money off pitching God. Then you've got a vested interest in it all being true, and you start lying to yourself. You start covering up your doubts, which is what my book is about. It's the reverse of that. It's saying let's embrace question, paradox, and doubt, and not just about religion, but about everything. Relationships, what we love and what we find beautiful, these things grow and they change.
Yeah. Mary has an interesting question. She says, have you found that there are a lot of people out there who grew up in conservative religion and then became disillusioned but still have deep spirituality?
Absolutely. And actually, I'm not pitching my book here, but honestly, Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God has generated hundreds of emails from just those people. And I just got another one this morning on the Facebook message section. By the way, anybody who wants to can find me, Frank Schaeffer, on Facebook or Twitter, any of these things. I answer the messages. And she was writing to me saying that, she had been homeschooled and she really has PTSD as a result. She was harshly disciplined. She's kind of left that background, but still has a great longing for spiritual content in her life. So one of the things that I try to do in the book is say, hey, listen, you do not have to just choose one or the other. There's another way to look at spirituality than choosing between fundamentalist faith on one hand and the absolutist position of, say, the new atheist movement on the other. Most of my readers, I think, would fall into the person's question, and that is they are people who have moved beyond perhaps their background or what they accepted as a younger person, but they certainly are not trying to throw away the spiritual content of their lives.
Yeah. Janet has a question. She says, would you describe yourself as a progressive Christian at all?
Yeah, I mean, I don't, the title of the book is an anti-labeling title. So right. It's tough to come up with a new label to describe myself. But to the extent that progressive Christianity leaves the door open, for instance, to realizing that people aren't going to burn in hell if they have the wrong theology, or that our relationships come ahead of trying to be right all the time about things, then, for lack of a better term, I would describe myself as a progressive Christian. Yes, I think I would. That's about as accurate as it would get. But I want to add something in keeping with the title of my book. That's a snapshot of where I'm at this afternoon. I always reserve the right to move in another direction and change my mind and to grow. I'm different now than I was at 17. I'm 62. If I make it to 82, I'm not saying I'll be where I am this afternoon answering these questions.
Mm-hmm. Now, Kristen says, being a grandfather to your granddaughter Lucy is a big part of why I am an atheist. And can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, right now Lucy's upstairs playing with her little brother Jack, and Jeannie's got Nora, and they're all in the other room. Jeannie and I divide our time between taking care of these three grandchildren of ours. They're not great grandchildren. I mean, they are great people who are grandchildren.
Nice.
I got married young, but it wasn't that crazy. Okay, so I have 5 grandkids. 2 of them are teenage, grown up, because I got married so young, and my daughter had kids when she was in her early 20s and so on. But these 3 little ones live across the street, and they're a huge part of my life. And one reason that Lucy figures so heavily into the book is I don't treat these issues of faith as a kind of a theoretical subject. I treat this as really an outworking of spirituality. To me, the lens that I see it through is through the people I love most. So I tell a story in the book about taking communion in the Greek Orthodox Church I go to because I like Byzantine liturgies, and having Lucy on my hip as I walked up to the communion line. And I was in a very depressed mood that day, and I shut my eyes and was shuffling forward in the line up to the chalice, and suddenly I felt a little touch on my face. And it was Lucy at 3 years old just looking right at me to see why her Ba, she calls me Ba, B-A, had his eyes closed. And suddenly I opened my eyes and I realized that I was looking at someone who only knew me now, and the things that depressed me about my past, my failings, my harshness with my kids when I was a teenage father, all these things I'm ashamed of. She doesn't know any of that. She just knows the unconditional love she's getting. And I was thinking to myself, wow, she sees me as I wish I could see myself. And what a gift that is. And then a thought crashed into my head, and that was, I have seen the face of God, in the sense that if there is a creator, and that creator loves us the way I love my little granddaughter Lucy, then that creator sees us as we wish we could see ourselves. Those are the sorts of insights that really mean something to me, far more than some theological theory. And right. So really I live out my own spirituality in connection with the things in my life that have that great meaning to me. And that's what the person who's read the book perhaps knows, and that is Lucy and the other grandchildren are woven through the book, because that's really the lens through which I see those parts of my life that I really, really care about, and I think other people do too. So I sort of back it off from the highfalutin arguments between atheism and Christianity and proofs and science, and get back into the area where I think most of us really live our lives.
Fantastic answer. Angela says, do you follow religious politics such as the Pope and his recent strides in the Catholic Church?
Yeah, very much so. Actually, I'm quite a fan of Pope Francis. I'm not in any sense a Roman Catholic, but in fact, I just blogged for Patheos about this today, because the Pope has really gone after the people who are anti-contraceptives in a kind of bleak way, but it must be giving the conservative right and the Roman Catholic Church fits. And so, yeah, I do follow that. Because, hey, listen, I blog on politics and faith. When Rachel Maddow or Sharpton or these guys put me on MSNBC, it's to comment on these issues. So I follow the impact of religion on politics because I'm someone who had a lot to do with that back in the day. And while I've changed my mind, I'm nevertheless very aware of the kind of insidious power or the power for good that comes from people in positions of some sort of moral leadership talking about these things. And so, yeah, I do. I read about Pope Francis and I write about him all the time.
Cool. Now, I'm sure religious people read your books. What's the feedback like that you get?
Well, it's surprising because from some they just hate my guts. I'm a traitor, to these people. But to a lot, they're on a very similar journey. So I get an amazing amount of email from people who describe themselves as survivors of evangelicalism, or survivors of fundamentalism, or even survivors of a certain type of Judaism. In fact, I got an email from someone who described herself as a survivor of militant atheism. The people who like my work are the people who are sick of seeing everything portrayed as a kind of a black and white, yes or no, in or out, saved or lost paradigm. And so there are a lot of folks who come from many backgrounds, who, including many religious backgrounds, who really relate to my books. And as I said earlier, who are still very much on a quest for their own spirituality, but who in no sense have abandoned that, but on the other hand are kind of sick of the way these issues are framed and find reading my stuff kind of a relief. They tell me I'm telling them their story. So I think there's, there are like-minded people out there, but they come from a diversity of backgrounds.
Yeah. Now, Julia is wondering, have you read the book Heaven is for Real? And if you have, do you have any thoughts on it?
Well, I think, are we talking about the book where the kid came out and said later that I get those been to heaven, want to report to you books mixed up, but this child who did this book then backed off on it and said that he had made it all up. But I think that actually is a sad thing, because these, from my point of view, are all very bogus projects, and just go to show the kind of money grubbing aspect of the evangelical world, where they would take advantage of some paraplegic kid who tells some tall story, publish it, now he's walking it all back, but that's after it became a New York Times bestseller and all the rest of it. And so, I kind of flinch at that stuff, thinking of my own kids and grandkids. This is not something that I would want to see them doing, and then having to sort of stand by and argue for the rest of your life. And it's typical of the kind of fundamentalist nonsense that's always looking for confirmation. So I don't think the publishers would believe something like that for a minute. They're cynics. But a lot of folks who read the book probably felt they could take some hope from it or something. But like I say in my book, I don't look for those kind of supernatural things as a sort of affirmation of faith, but rather to those ordinary things that happen all the time with my grandchildren and in ordinary life.
Now, going back to your grandchildren, what do you tell them when they ask if God is real?
Well, there I'm very much my evangelical mother's son, in the sense that they've never asked me that exactly, but my granddaughter, and I talk about it in the book, one time asked me, who made this rock, going and standing on a big outcropping of granite in the marsh, and my response to her was God did. But then on other times when, I read her Bible stories and Greek mythology, and if she mixes them up, I don't do what my mother would have done and say, hey, listen, this is all real and this is false. So we have discussions about what might have happened or not happened, and I'm certainly not pitching religion to her as factual, at somehow she's got to believe this stuff, but rather as a series of interesting stories she's going to have to make her own mind up about.
Yeah. Now, we have a couple more questions coming through, which is great. Do you read any reviews on the book, and what has the general response been since its release?
Well, it's been good. I mean, the reviews I've read have come from all sides. One that was in Publishers Weekly about the book was actually by the religious news service editor who sits on their atheist desk, and she loved the book. Conversely, I had some other atheists who hate it, said, he's stealing our word, and he's not a real atheist. They're kind of literalists, like their own kind of fundamentalists. I have Christians, some evangelicals who have attacked the book, but again, so far, and I believe this is actually true, the reviews have been very favorable, because I think people are refreshed by having a point of view that they don't hear all the time. That leaves the door open for a lot of categories of diverse opinion, but at the same time is, concentrates on the human experience of spirituality with my children and grandchildren rather than trying to preach at people. So far, the reviews have been good. Now, what I don't read is a lot of comments on my blogs and reviews when it gets down to every Amazon review and that kind of thing, because then it's crazy. You're waiting around with trolls and all the rest of it, and it just gets too discouraging.
Mm-hmm. Kristen says, why did you think this memoir was so important to write, and how long did it take you to actually complete the book?
Well, obviously the ideas here and the life represented is something that's been going on for a long time. I actually worked on this book about 2.5 years. And it clocked in much longer at first, and I actually trimmed it back, trying to make it more accessible to people. And sometimes actually writing something a little shorter is more difficult than just writing everything you wanted to. You've got to concentrate on what you're really trying to do and say, and what will be the most appealing to people, and so on. But, it was basically a 2.5 year project.
Marilyn wants to know, what's the future of the religious right movement in the U.S.?
Well, that's what I've been blogging about on Salon. If you go to salon.com and look at my last 2 blogs, you get a long answer to that question. But I think they've become very powerful and re-energized with the Republican Tea Party takeover of the Senate and Congress. Unfortunately, these guys are not going to go away. They have radicalized the Republican Party through the Tea Party, which is mostly evangelical. And tragically, this is just going to keep going.
Right. Now, Bridie wants to know a little bit just about your parents and how they influenced your views. I mean, you've spoken about this a little more. Do you think that you agreed with them? Were you forced to agree with their views? Can you talk a little bit more about kind of that upbringing?
Well, anybody who reads Why I'm an Atheist Who Believes in God will see quickly that I'm very fond of my mother and dad. They both passed away now, but I remember them with great fondness. And I talk actually in the book about my last conversations with my mother, actually with Lucy sitting on my lap, Skyping her and so forth. My disagreement with my parents over their theology is very different than what they did with their lives. The one thing I talk about with them is that I think they were blessedly hypocritical. And what I mean by that is that they were much better people than their theology. If you just take Calvinist fundamentalist theology on its own and look at it, it's very hard and cold. Say, treating gay people badly. But if you look at how my parents actually opened their ministry to the gay people who came and did not demand they change or be saved or get out or any of these things, they actually treated people as if they were liberal humanists, whatever their official theology was. So I have a tremendous deal of respect for my parents in terms of just the way they function with other human beings, which from my point of view, as I talk about in the book in terms of trying to look at what Jesus was about, is actually following the example of how Jesus dealt with people. So I have not only a great deal of respect and love for my parents, I look at their Christian ministry in 2 halves. I look at the theology, which in lots of ways I've moved past and disagree with. But I also look at the way they related to people, and they put a lot of people who consider themselves to be liberal and open-minded to shame, because they were very, very, very kind, open, generous, giving people.
Now, Clark says, I believe in God, but sometimes I believe in other things as well. Does that make me a conflicted person?
No, I would just say Clark is in the same boat I am, and if he reads my book and writes me an email, we'll have a good exchange. But I would just say Clark's actually telling the truth, because Clark is actually saying what 99.99, except crazy certainty addicts or mental patients, would say was really true. In fact, I get emails from pastors saying, I would say what you're saying if I could say this without getting fired. I think a lot of people hang on to their faith just for family relationship reasons, or they don't want to piss off their wife, or they were raised that way and they're scared of the reaction, or they earn a paycheck through religion. But I think actually Clark is telling the truth about where most people who have spirituality and religion as part of their life really live. And my book says, hey, you know what? This is not a problem. In fact, this shows you're a sane, thinking person. Stay there and don't worry about this.
Now, Robert Rhoades just sent in a question. He says, it was very difficult for me to free myself from the meme of hell and allow myself to be an unbeliever. He says, the meme of hell, interesting. How did you free yourself from the bonds of dogma?
Well, the short answer is I haven't. And listen, if you look at neuropsychologists, they tell us that actually our neural pathways in our brains change. Say if you play young children classical music, their brains grow differently than if you're blasting them with rap or no music. If you don't touch a child when they're young, their brains develop differently. If you're raised strict fundamentalist, you're never going to get away from the idea of, ooh, wow, is God about to smack me down, even if intellectually you don't believe that anymore. So I would just say live with it. And gradually, you'll find that those fears begin to subside. But don't expect that just because you've changed your mind, you can change your emotions. And again, this is paradoxical, but it's not a bad thing. It's just the way we are. Hey, listen, I had polio when I was 2. I walk with a limp. I've learned to deal with it. It's not going away. I still fear the wrath of a God, a type of God I don't believe in. But that doesn't mean that knee-jerk PTSD to exposure to that kind of angry religion where God hates you enough that he's going to burn you forever. Something I wouldn't do to my grandchildren, by the way, no matter what they did. So it's weird to think God would do that if he's the creator, but
right.
Different discussion there. But, we can never get past it completely. So don't be discouraged if you still get if this still comes crashing in once in a while.
Mm-hmm. Angela says, what has been your overall approach to dealing with counterculture?
Well, of course, I've kind of had a long trajectory here, so, I'm a different person now than I used to be, but my overall approach has been I consider my own view countercultural today. And that is that when I see that I get the same kind of opposition from the new atheist movement sometimes as I do from fundamentalist Christians, change a word or two in their emails, when they're after me online, and it would be the same. They all want certainty. And I look at them and I say, you have deformed your neurological pathways, because you have actually become certainty addicts now. So you need your next fix of absolute certainty the way a drug addict needs his next line of cocaine or whatever it might be. But there are a lot of people who aren't like that, and I would just say, I believe the view I'm proposing is countercultural. It doesn't fit easily into the predetermined kind of media handle type definitions. And I'm happy to be there.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's no short answer to this, but what do you see, what's the major difference in, evangelical or just, major religions in the U.S. as opposed to other countries? I know that you were born in Switzerland.
We're more fanatical in some ways than, say, Europe, and I don't mean to insult anybody, we're a lot closer to Saudi Arabia than we are to Europe. In other words, we're a country that's so influenced by right-wing, crazy, fundamentalist religion that everything gets very, 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 very extreme here. And when you look at the Tea Party lies that have been told about Barack Obama, for instance, through Fox News and other sources, you realize that you're dealing with people who are as intransigent and fact-free and against facts, calling him a Muslim and all this crazy stuff. This is sort of the language that extremism of all types uses and is normally more associated with the kind of extremism you see coming out of the Islamist parties today. We got it right here in the name of Christianity. So, I'm afraid America is very tainted by our far-right religion.
Mm-hmm. Now, how did we get that way? It's amazing.
It's the background. I mean, we were settled by Puritans who were escaping to make a perfect country, a city set on a hill. So we've always had a beginning which is infused with this sort of stuff. And then the whole evangelical movement came along with Billy Graham and others. And then, unfortunately, as I talk about, my family was part of politicizing that movement. So it was less about Jesus and more about winning votes. And now it's about the Republican Party. And, the Koch brothers are cleaning up and the rest of us are picking up the pieces.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Robert Rhoades says, he has another question. He says, I did manage to free my emotions. It did take decades. What are your beliefs now? I don't know. The book is about the beliefs, but let's put it this way. I don't mean to be a smart aleck here, but I'm an atheist who believes in God. I'm someone who, as I put it in the book, functions on the basis of science and fact, and yet feels an offstage presence in my life that is real, that I feel is a divine presence, and that's just how I express it. Mm-hmm. Now, when you're not writing, we know you are an artist, and what else do you do just to kind of unwind?
Hey, I take care of my grandchildren, I cook, I garden, and I build. I do a lot of construction. I've rebuilt a lot of this old 1835 brick house I'm in, and I'm helping my son in his crazy old 1865 salt box. So, we're deep into deteriorating New England houses that have to take a lot of work.
Fantastic. That's great. Now, one last question. What do you think was the most challenging part of writing this book?
The most challenging issue for me is always just getting it done as well as you can. But in this particular case, it was to be as vulnerable as I could be and just not feel threatened by the fact that I would contradict myself in this book, because we do. Mm-hmm. And not try to smooth it out and make it like a book, and make it more like a real conversation where, hey, you have to admit you are of two minds sometimes. I mean, this is like a conversation with me over a couple of drinks. It's not a sermon. And so the challenge is just making yourself that vulnerable and being willing to put up something that you're handing people who will be cynical ammunition by being as truthful as you can.
Excellent. Well, it was great having you on today. It was so insightful, and we're always, happy to chat with you. And we just want to tell everybody that we are giving away a copy of Why I'm an Atheist. So after the chat, head over to booktrib.com and enter to win. And thank you so much for joining us, Frank.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.